Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to virtual Meet the Winemaker class. I've got Scott Caraccioli from Caraccioli Cellars in California, where we are going to be tasting two of their premium sparkling wines that will be available throughout all of December and January too, if you're like me and like cheersing to the new year, not just the end of a year. So welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon, and it is a pleasure to meet you virtually.
Likewise, and thank you for having me, Kara. Excited to chat.
Yes, excellent. Well, I'll introduce the two wines that we're gonna be tasting through. And then while they open up in the glass, because I just brushed my teeth recently, so I'm gonna need a few sips before we can get into the tasting notes. I'd love to just hear your history of Caraccioli Cellars, if you can condense it, how you got to where you are and what you are doing now. So real quick, for those of you who are tuning in, we're gonna start off with Caraccioli 2013 Brut Cuvée. This is the Santa Lucia Highlands. And we have also their Brut Rosé, also 2013, also Santa Lucia Highlands. So those are the two wines that we're going to be tasting. They're in my glass, and I'll keep sipping on them and getting my palate revved up and ready to go while I hear your story, Scott.
Perfect. So kind of to give everybody a little bit of context on where we're talking in terms of the country, the state of California, we're basically in the middle and the central coast. Monterey Bay is just to the north of the Santa Lucia Highlands. We're in the middle of Monterey County. So we have a huge influence from the bay that creates a wind funnel coming down. And we have very fertile soils where you live in the Salinas Valley, which is a large producer for agriculture. And that's what my family historically did, and really how we got into viticulture and ultimately winemaking was the valley floor in the Salinas Valley is optimally fertile for all of the row crop agriculture. The fingers above on the foothills are what ultimately made up the Santa Lucia Highlands. So as we've been farming for 70 years and time goes on, and you realize that the foothills are not ideal for agriculture, that kind of transitions to let's go plant grapes, where the elevation change doesn't matter, irrigation is much more minimal, all of the things that make it bad farmland make it optimal land to plant a vineyard. And it's a really cool climate. So we have a great environment for Pinot and Chardonnay, which is what ultimately got us excited. The project of making sparkling wine, all method champenois, all within the French style, but really wanting to showcase the Santa Lucia Highlands and the California sunshine that makes home for me. And in 2006 is when we started the whole project. And it was just when my father and uncles had met Michel Salg, who had retired from Roeder Estate. Michel had been at Roeder from like 79 to 04. So he was the founding winemaker there. He came here from France to basically start the project. And once he retired in 04, he really kind of was looking for what his passion project would be. And at the same time, we had decided to plant one of the benches above our agriculture land, in which is ultimately the Escole Vineyard. It's 124 acres of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. Now I have a little bit of Gamay and a little bit of Syrah coming online as well. But original plantings was all Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And my father meeting Michel really led to a likened vision of where we were going, which was controlling the whole process from beginning to end and essentially making grower champagne in the United States in terms of matching the cellar to the place, but not wanting it. I don't want it to be champagne. That's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to abide by those practices in the cellar, but also showcase where we're from. And you definitely should get that warmth, that next level of things that make California wine great, that sunshine, that ripeness. And while definitely all of our wines are more on the racy side, definitely structurally driven, that wind I was talking about that comes down the valley really preserves the acidity and allows us to age something as long as we do on the lees and produce something that will withstand the test of time and comes out of primary fermentation and secondary fermentation with optimal chemistry, which is really important in sparkling wine, even more so than in still wine. The variation's a lot smaller and things happen faster at 19 bricks than they do at 23.
So let's break this down just a little bit, just in terms of how these wines are made. So both of these are a blend of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. Are you vinifying them as still wines separately, then making your cuvee, and then secondary fermentation in the bottle, correct?
Correct. So they're getting processed at night, hand harvest, small totes. We kind of fall more on like the reductive side of the spectrum of sparkling wine, as
And
opposed
real
to being
quick, can
very
you explain what reductive is for everyone who's tuning in?
It's the opposite. We want to really preserve the fruit, and I want to preserve and limit any type of contact with oxygen so the wines don't become oxidative. And preserving the fruit starts in the vineyard, starts at night, making sure the berries are cold. We harvest into small yellow totes, so they're 25 pounds instead of a half-ton macro, which is 1,000 pounds. So you really have two clusters on top of each other. You have no premature pressing. So once we load the press, it's whole berries and whole clusters. There's no juice in every tray. It allows us to preserve that fruit at night. And because the clusters are cold, the berries stay tight on the Reiki. And really the whole cluster stays intact until we want to start the pressing process. We press everything in a Cocard gravity press, which it's like the old bucket presses that you see in Champagne, that basket presses that go down into the ground in the cellars and the domains. It's essentially taking that out, flipping it on its side, so you could ship it across the country with modern technology. And so the ram comes from the side and you load it from the top. So you get the same benefits of those pressings that it's a champagne press with modern technology, so I can keep all the press cycles separated. For Caraccioli, we only press at 120 gallons a ton, so very, very light. The cuvee being the heart juice of each grape, less protein content, smaller bubbles, as well as the more you press, the more you're likely to introduce off that you may want. So keeping the press in a good press is very important for us. Then it'll get racked to tank. It'll get vinified all the way dry into tank where we make the vin clairs. Lots will be kept separate. I don't even press from 120 to 150. I clean the press and get the next load in. I think it's more important for the preservation of the next press load as opposed to giving myself 30 gallons a ton that I'm never going to put in our brand to go sell on the bulk market. It's more important to preserve the next lot in. And I try to maintain that same line of really, it's the pillars that define our process that were set up by Michel and his tenure at Roeder and his belief in what the best way to make vintage method Champenois wines is. And I don't want to recreate the model. I take his truths. He was with us from 06 until he passed away in 17. And then where we go from here was something he and I talked a lot about for the next 20, 30 years of the vision of the project and where he really kind of saw the honing in over time going. And so everything that, like, all the little things that we do, from what press we use, how we press it, fermentations, all of those things were really dictated and really specified early on, and then perfected over time. With now we're continuing to hone it, but we have a pretty great baseline of what to expect. Especially now I'm in vintage 2020. The 2013s, which we'll taste today, were about a third estate. 14s were half, 15s were full estate. So the more control you have over the whole process, the more implementation you're able to do throughout the process, and really being able to showcase your fruit in what you believe is the most optimal way.
Awesome. Real quick, before we go on to how long the wines were aged on the lees and your process of that and your philosophy of that, to go back to the bubble structure and how the pressings result in a different bubble structure. So obviously it's not just the yeast that you use or how the secondary fermentation process happens. A lot goes into the bubble structure beforehand. So can you walk us through some of the science behind the pressings and how they affects the overall bubble structure?
Yeah, for Michelle and everything, it always came down to like protein content, and that led to size of bubbles. So the more you press the load, you'll end up with a higher protein content. So if you stop it at 120, the overall amount in the cuvee is less. So once you go through secondary fermentation, you'll be able to get a finer, cleaner mousse without introducing gallons 121 to 150, not to mention 151 to 180. So really ensuring that we abide by the things that like would guide a Tete de Cuvée within a program really are the same pillars that guide us. And I think the mousse behind that, which is something that Michelle was really specific about, was always, adhering to those processes throughout, making sure we have clean fermentations, and not allowing any outside influence affect our ability to get to where, the other big piece of it is you really have to come out of primary fermentation at about 10.75%. And if you're going to do that,
Alcohol,
then you
right?
add alcohol.
Yeah.
And the reason being, which is about 19 bricks, give or take. And the point for that is if your vin clears are 10.75%, then you can use 24 grams a liter back to start secondary, which will give you about 1.25% alcohol through secondary. So you'll get to 12. When sparkling wines start to push 12%, they start to become a lot more really viscous and stop being as lifted with the mousse throughout the process, which will ultimately make them and the mousse become a lot less expressive and the fruit a lot less expressive, and just ultimately kind of dumb them down a little bit. And if you have too much alcohol, the same thing can happen. So if you come out of primary at 11.25 and then you go through that, you're going to end up coming out of it at 12.5%, which can do the same type of situation. Or you add less sugar, you don't have the atmospheres, and you won't get to 6 atmospheres. So that will directly affect your mousse and the liveliness of the mousse.
Okay, awesome. And just for anyone tuning in and you're unsure of what bricks are basically like a measure of the sugar content of the grapes at harvest. The fermentation 101, yeast eats the sugar of the grape and the byproduct is carbon dioxide and alcohol. So the higher the sugar content is of the grapes at harvest means higher alcohol content. So if you pick when the grapes are super ripe and super sweet, you're going to get higher alcohol content wine. So what he's talking about, managing alcohol in bricks, picking at ripeness but not overripe, is really, really key for sparkling wine to maintain acidity and regulate that alcohol. So just to break down a little bit of the science for anyone who isn't a winemaker out there.
Perfect.
So can you talk to me about these wines, how long they were aged on the lees, and whether or not you're like hand spinning these bottles down in your cellar, what the process is?
Yeah, so everybody has that vision of the Frenchman down there churning, and it really it being a hand driven product, and it is throughout the whole process. We actually riddle everything on cages, but before we get to there, we combine all the lots, and because we kind of really do the pressing distinguishes the cuvées we're blending there, as opposed to getting lots that we think maybe are marginalized because we overpress. Usually we've cut very, very few lots in the 14 years that didn't make the overall lot. We didn't make any sparkling wine in 11 because it wasn't there in the vineyard, and nothing came in. So we kind of, you have it before you bring it in. So most all of our lots every year actually get added to the press, which ends up being gets added to the overall lot that will determine the Brut Cuvée and the Brut Rosé. The Brut Cuvée will be 60% Chardonnay, 40% Pinot Noir. And that will all get added to a vat. We will bottle that. We'll start secondary fermentation with the yeast starter. And then we will have basically isolated a couple barrels of red wine Pinot Noir that we feel will complement the Cuvée. And that's how we make our rosé is red wine edition, not doing any Saignée. For Michel, that was way too risky, just from a standpoint of he was a control freak. He's made me the same way. Why give up control in something when you don't have to? It's more expensive to do final good to final good, where you've vinified red wine as red wine and then add that back to your, it's a couple barrels, which would be 55 cases and a barrel, or 25 cases a barrel, so 55 cases maybe going into the whole lot. But at the end of the day, it makes for a product where we know where we're going before we get in the car and start it. And we can do trials of these barrels at different addition levels weeks before. We do everything on site. So I can actually go do production samples with our own equipment, lay it down for a couple months and see before we start tirage what I actually like. And when we blind taste with the team, and then we'll add that red wine back at the percentage we see fit, and then we will bottle the rosé. Then it'll sit on tirage for 4 years. We'll do the same thing at about 3.5 years. I'll do production samples of dosage levels. And then before we actually do disgorgement and dosage, we'll run those samples, we'll blind ourselves again and see where we come out. Usually it varies very, very little year over year. But we still go through the exercise of making sure that there's nothing different. 15, for instance, was a lower crop level, higher expression, more concentration. So we actually lowered dosage in 15, for example. But in general, it sits pretty standard year over year. And then the Brut age is about 9 months. Brut is about a year, 14 months before we release it. Rosé is about 9 months, give or take. It kind of depends on the vintage. I taste them as they go through. Firm believer that dosage needs to marry with the cuvee after you actually do disgorgement. They're relatively disjointed fresh out of disgorgement for me, and I think the red wine and the rosé help it become purposeful earlier on in its lifespan.
Awesome. Sorry, I think we broke up for a little bit there, but I get what you were saying. So just to clarify a couple of terms for anyone watching, dosage is basically, so after you do secondary fermentation in the bottle, you have all of this yeast that's now dead and floating in the bottle that's giving a little bit of texture to the wine for 3.5 to 4 years. You want to expel that because no one wants all of that in your wine. And when you expel that, you put dosage of a little bit of sugar back in and a little bit of wine back in the bottle to replace any of the space loss and to make sure your wine is balanced. So sometimes wines will be labeled Brut, which means dry, but they'll have little minuscule amounts of residual sugar in there just to kind of balance some of the incredible acidity that some of these sparkling wines have. So can you talk to us about, has there been a vintage where you've done 0 grams of residual sugar? So basically like a Brut 0 up to like the max that you've ever added as a dosage?
Yeah, so I have done 0, but I've done it as a run, not as these wines have never been 0. Our Nature bottlings, like the label's white, I don't put a ribbon on them or foil, and they're essentially naked without sugar. I tend to believe what Michel does, which was the fact that the more dosage, with no dosage, it's harder to make a no dosage wine, and in general they end up being not the greatest representation of the cuvee. You want the Maillard reaction to occur. You want to add sugar at dosage, even if it's in a smaller amount, so you have that expression occurring of more savory characteristics. And I think it really blends the yeasty, brioche characteristics with the fruit really well when you have the right dosage level. And it's really one of the only tools that a sparkling winemaker has to balance. So in the least I've ever done is actually 8, and mostly it's 11.5. Most all of our Brut and Brut Rosés are 11.5 year over year. The 15 was 8. We varied a little bit in a couple other years, but not much. Part of that is once we went a state and I bumped the pick points a little bit, and I had more control because we weren't having things come in a little bit under and a little bit over. The grapes are maturing very fast at 19 bricks. It's not like in still wine at 23 where they're really creeping along. In sparkling wine, yesterday's okay, tomorrow's okay, today was the right answer. In still
like
wine,
avocados.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an avocado, where still wine, you could have a few days that they're all the right answer. So until we had complete control, we were had a little bit more range of lots that we would have, some coming in a little bit underripe, some coming in a little bit overripe, where once we had the whole complete, it was easier just to be like, okay, 19 bricks. And it should vary very little within that. And that overall, and being able to get that perfected has led to a balance in acidity that's a little bit more cohesive within the cuvee, and thus will ultimately probably mean dosage is less as time goes on, just because it won't need as much of a balancing between the structure of the wine and the overall fruit expression, and then the autolytic characteristics as well. It's kind of like the blending of the two. The sugar is kind of the grease that makes it all go around.
Yeah. And to me, makes it so much more palatable when you're not aging your wine for 10, 15 years. So I really appreciate that. And thank you. Tell me, so I know like, and obviously champagne, you have up to 12 grams of residual sugar per liter allowed to be called it Brut. Is there a specification in California wine, a legal parameter for Brut labeling, or are you going by the French standard? Because I didn't know if the California standard is different. I'm going to admit my ignorance.
I've always went by the French standard.
Okay.
So
okay.
I've never really even ever looked into it beyond what the French law was. Just I adhere to everything else besides the grapes, obviously not being from possible. So that wasn't something that ever even really crossed my mind till right now.
Okay, gotcha. It was just I realized I didn't actually know that. Laws are always changing, and I passed my SOM exam 5 years ago, so I'm not up to date with all of the new laws and stuff like that. So super fascinating. By the way, I just tried your still Chardonnay a couple weeks ago, and oh my God, it is stunning. So it's a rare California Chardonnay that I'm like, I want to drink this every day, but that wine is incredible. So thank you also for making brilliant still wines as well.
I appreciate that. Try to make them in the same kind of style and the vein. Like if you were to taste the Vin Clairs in Chardonnay lots completely, and then taste where our still Chardonnay ends up, and then do the same thing with Pinot lots, and then where Pinot Rosé is, which is basically like Vin Gris, Vin Clair, that ends up at like 22.5, 23 bricks. It's really interesting to see like the likening of expression, especially as things are all estate now, because it's far more transparent of sight just as times went on, which is really fun for me. So I'm glad you enjoyed them.
Absolutely. Awesome. Can you talk to me about, obviously you've just been making this since 2006. So we don't have 20 years yet of seeing how these wines aged, but how have you seen the aging of your wines over the past 14 years?
I think they age really well for California sparkling wine, for whatever that's worth in terms of when people kind of put it in the box. But I drank an 06 recently. Obviously, the older they get, the more they go towards older sparkling wine, older champagne style. I mean, everything does that. They become a little bit less viscous, a little bit more vinous. The rosé goes a little bit more savory. It does a little bit more of a mushroom thing the older that it gets. And I think that Pinot character really kind of starts to show itself which is really great. As they get older, they almost become more of their own animal. And as time goes on, just the rosé being more of the Pinot Noir expression and the Brut Cuvée being more of the Chardonnay expression. I think from just a straight ageability perspective, the Brut Cuvée will have a longer ageability. I drank an 07 recently that was really alive, really bright, really clean, especially in all of the magnums, which I do a decent amount of magnums as well. And things age even, I think probably some of the vintages are maybe 2 years behind where they would be if they were in 750, just because of how much slower it ages. So it's interesting to see that paradigm as well between the 750 and the Magnum and the ageability. But I drank an 09 recently and it was awesome, completely alive, tasted on vintage. So they age really well. The structure of them, the pH is like 2.95. All of the TAs are 10 plus. So like they have the chemistry to go the distance. It's just a matter of really how you like to drink your sparkling wine, I think, a little bit. Some people really like really vibrant, effervescent, youthful sparkling. And a lot of people also like a little bit more of the richness and the autolytic character. As they get older, you definitely get more of the French bakery in right on the nose, all the way kind of through the palate. And they get a little bit more oxidative, obviously, as they get older as well. But starting on the more reductive side, they have a decent amount of age to go before they kind of get there. So they age pretty gracefully, in my opinion.
Yeah. I think, by the way, when you're starting to release the 15s, which will be 100% estate fruit, I think on the bottom you should create a serial number, and on the front put RM for Recoltant Manipulant for grower. Maybe like CRM, California Recoltant Manipulant or something. I think that'd be fantastic. So I want to just highlight, first of all, how amazing it is, how involved you are in the whole process, how everything is done by hand. I worked harvest in Oregon last year, and we're processing everything by the half ton, quarter ton, in terms of crates. So thinking about the manual labor that goes into harvesting just by 25-pound crates, like how much more work by hand is involved in that along every step of the process. And for vintage champagne, you're going to spend a whole lot more. For Grand Cru champagne, a whole lot more. For vintage champagne, minimum aging on the lees is 3 years, and you're doing 3.5 to 4 years. So you're taking the standards of Grand Cru, grower, vintage champagne, and surpassing that even at the price of what normal champagne costs. So kudos to you. Thank you for bringing this into our lives. I'm so excited to be drinking this all December long. I think it will be in my refrigerator and drinking at breakfast, because that's what 2020 has done. So
touche, well put.
And I also love, so I've been a fan of your rosé for a while. This is the first time I've actually tried your Brut Cuvée. I've done your Brut Rosé at a couple of restaurants, but the Brut Cuvée is my first time. I've loved the rosé. It's amazing. But I did a lot of the Pinot Noir rosés in just the 500 milliliter bottles, and I would sell it with straws. So you would just like the classic champagne bottle, walk around with a straw in the bottle. Was perfect. And magnums too, because why not? So
they're personal size.
I've loved all your wines. Yeah, I like it. Yes.
Thank you.
Happy meal size. Yeah. So can you talk to me about, everyone is always asking me whenever I talk with them about like how the California producers that I work with were affected by the fires. So you're higher up and you're further away than a lot of the other fires were, but how do you see California as a whole, like figuring out how to deal with the fires and what to do in the future to prevent, mitigate, or deal with it?
Ooh, I could talk about this for a while. So I'll try to be succinct. I think, so we were affected by the fire this year pretty extensively. There was a fire in Monterey County called the River Fire that burned essentially like near where I live, basically to my vineyard, and then down to it. It was right after we started harvesting sparkling wine. So all my sparkling wine in 2020 is fine. All my Chardonnay is fine. All my Pinot Rosé is fine. But I did not make any red wine in 2020, nor did I sell any fruit to make red wine to any of the people that buy grapes from us. So it was a less than optimal year in that standpoint. But the thing to me, you know, are we, I guess the bottom line is, are we going to have fires? We probably are going to have fires in the future. We've been having fires for 5 years now. We had them in 2016 when Big Sur caught on fire, and then they've jumped from between Napa, Sonoma, Santa Barbara, and home for the since 16. And I think we would all be a little short-sighted to say that it's going to go away. I think the ability to deal with the fire and to deal with smoke taint and know what you're up against in terms of your ability to make wine, when to pull the pin, when to go forward and to make the wine. And that's less defined than I would have thought it was, with having a really big problem this year in terms of it just being in our backyard. In 16, it was really far away. We really had no smoke damage whatsoever. Everything was testing non-existent in the Santa Lucia Highlands, where this year the hill behind the vineyard burned. So it was a very different circumstance, but wanting to be as on top of it and transparent, both to the people that buy our fruit and that are our partners in the vineyard and, you know, believe in what we're doing, as well as my own project. And in terms of Caraccioli and maintaining the quality that we do and the parameters that dictate what we're going to do, it was, you know, figuring out the smoke taint, how much of it had affected the grapes, where we were going to really come out with in terms of like finished fermentations and what wines would be testing, and if that was something we were comfortable with. And I learned a lot this year and definitely was able to attain knowledge that I didn't have going into it. And I would imagine there's going to be a lot more science in the coming years as we're able, well, we have more, you know, samples is the bottom line. Like there's more places that are catching fire, where most of the literature was Australian before this. And I don't know how burning eucalyptus is exactly the same as burning oak and brush. I think it's different in terms of, I just think it's all different. And I don't think we know enough about it. We're in the infancy of it. And I don't think it's going anywhere. I think our ability to mitigate it in the cellar and know what we're dealing with in the vineyard is really what's going to find producers, and what you're willing to put your name on. I'm not willing to put my name on something that has hints of a cigar on it. It's not. But it's a reality, and it's farming, and that's what it is. So you deal with the variables at hand, you figure out the best way to solve them, and you go forward. It's a fact of what we do.
Yeah, man, between the fires and COVID, wineries all over the world have had quite a hit, but especially in California. So with the incredible like hand involved, like very individual nature of how you make your wine, how did COVID change things for you in terms of, did you have to do smaller crews or do shifts of different people working, or did everyone just wear masks and figure it out?
Vineyards are actually pretty easy because the spacing.
Yeah.
So you have vines that are, you know, so many feet apart in terms of the rows, and then you have vines that are so many feet apart in terms of the individual vines. So there's naturally kind of a way for people to socially distance and the way that they worked. So it was, by the time most of the viticulture work came around, because we were in, you know, we started getting March 17th, we got locked down, I think, in California, right before St. Patrick's Day, right around it. By the time most of the vineyard practices started, we'd already been implementing them in agriculture and row crops. which was much more stringent. So like the rollout for me wasn't as difficult. It was, obviously the number one priority is maintaining everybody's safety and keeping everybody, doing the right practices in the vineyard and, on the farming side, on the agriculture. And it was one of those things that it was just a living process while you were dealing with it. You would go to bed and feel like you knew what you were doing in terms of like, okay, yeah, now I got that compliance, that order that was rolled out from the governor's office, and now I'm I got it all like implemented. And then you'd wake up and something else would happen, and then you would just implement something new. And that the sooner you realize that was going to be the reality, I think the better off you were going to be. And just taking it day by day and doing the best thing you can have with what you have at hand and the information you have, and just with people maintaining safety being the top priority. And that makes it kind of easy too, because that becomes 1A, and then everything else just kind of feeds off of it in terms of how you dictate. So like process. So I think for us, we really weren't affected like the winery wasn't affected by COVID, in that I wasn't unable to achieve anything in a timeline that it needed to be achieved in. It was just a little bit more difficult while it was happening, a little bit more moving wheels, crews were a little bit more spread out because you were keeping everybody, distanced, as well as moving people from commodity to commodity. So it worked out. It was just a little bit more of a Tetris than normal year.
Yeah. But as farmers are resilient by nature. So I think y'all had plenty of practice in that skill set that made it easier for you in terms of just a transition. Before we finish, I do want to actually get tasting notes on the two wines, the Brut Cuvée and the Brut Rosé. Can you tell us your favorite glass, first of all, to experience these wines in? I'm using the Riedel Extreme champagne flutes. I never like a flute because I want to smell my wine. But I see you're using basically it looks like just a white wine glass.
Yeah, it's like an AP. So
I tell people to throw out all of their flutes unless they're just making mimosas. So
yeah, I have flutes because most people like flutes and most people like to see the mousse. It kind of becomes a visual over, would you like to see the mousse and the viscosity of the wine, or get a next level of sensory from smell? And to me, when I'm evaluating wines, I always want it out of an AP at least. And I try to actually laser etch the bottom of these so they have a central point for them to go, as opposed to where they'll lose it really fast if you just put it in like a burgundy glass or whatever. That's what, they would just do it with like a little ice pick at the bottom of the glass and make a little infraction, and that's where it will centralize. They always print them in champagne flutes, but then in regular wine glasses, that's part of why you actually lose the mousse faster, isn't because it's that smaller of a neck. That's part of it, but it's also because there's no piece for the bubble bead to centralize. So I like being able to have a nose. So I personally prefer APs. I'll drink it out of a flute. It's fine. People like the celebration of it. I don't personally love coupes. I'd probably rather drink it out of a burgundy glass than a coupe. Mm-hmm. So, but it's one of those things, to each his own too. It's kind of like you can tell somebody all of the reasons they should like a wine till you're red in the face, but if they don't like it in their mouth, it doesn't really matter. So if you like drinking out of a flute, drink out of a flute. If you like drinking out of a red wine glass, drink out of a red wine glass. I think it's partially an individual's preference on how much they weigh the nose.
Awesome.
Yeah. So the Brut compared to the Brut Rosé, do you want me to go over them a little bit, just in terms of?
Yeah, I'd love to, and then I'll tell you my thoughts if.
Cool. So I I find the Brut to be a little bit more of like the brioche bread basket than the rosé. I think the rosé shows a little bit less of that. I think you get more of like the red fruit, the strawberry, the bright like cranberry off of the nose of the rosé, where the Brut ends up being a little bit more citrus driven, more of like the lemon, the lime peel, kind of in context with the bready characteristic of the leasiness. Yeah, it's always interesting to me because in my head, they always show themselves as being more Chardonnay driven in the Brut and more Pinot driven in the Rosé. But a lot of times when the Brut gets older, and 13 now, we're 7 years off of when we made it, so it's been off of lease for almost 3 years. It's definitely showing like a richness that I think is just on the nose, really providing a cohesive expression.
Yeah, the 13 Brut Cuvée for me, I open these up on live Facebook, which is always scary to do a tasting note on live Facebook, because you just say the first thing that comes to your brain. And lemon was all about there, but now that it's opening up more, I'm getting a little bit of like this sweet herb thing, like tarragon or sage, like that kind of rounds it out. And the brioche is there, but it's definitely not overpowering the fruit. And I appreciate the balance of that. But I'm just struck by the elegance and the finesse of the bubble structure. It's just like tiny bubbles, but they don't feel slicing. They don't feel like abrasive. They're delightful, but they're super fine grained. And I'm really digging this wine for sure.
Thank you.
So what about the Brut Rosé? How is that? Oh man, so way more savory notes on this. So on the live video I did before this, I definitely get some mushrooms and like white cherry is what I was saying on this. But now that it's opening up, still getting those mushrooms, like almost pickled mushrooms, if that's and some of the strawberries, but the herbs are there, but instead of like the sweet herbs that I'm getting, like the tarragon and sage, I'm getting a little bit more like bay leaf and a little bit of thyme, like a little bit more of these bitter herbs with the mushrooms that go along with this like unctuous pink and red fruit. So it's a really fun juxtaposition, the fruit and the savory components and earthiness of this wine.
I agree with you completely. I think like the savory notes that go through both of the wines are transparent in the still wines as well. Like, and to me, that's kind of the sense of place. If you're standing on the hillside and you're going to get the chaparral, the bay laurel, the sage, all of the stuff that grows in the mountains adjacent the vineyard. So kind of trying to be transparent in our winemaking. I think that the Pinot, you definitely get those, that bay leaf chaparral quality that kind of comes through in the red wine that then gets added back. So I think it's more expressive in the Brut Rosé, where I think the Chardonnay the Brut Cuvée, which has maybe more of a Chardonnay expression, has more of like the sweet herbs, like you were saying, and almost like a salinity that kind of like lines around like those, where it's a little bit more unctuous in the rosé, and I think it's the red wine that kind of like fills it out.
Yeah, the minerality, like that textural sensation, not just from the bubbles, but also that. So can you talk to me real quick? You talked about fertile soils. We know that that's not the greatest thing for wine. So we're up on the hills. Are the soils, can you talk to us about the composition of soils? We get really geeky about soils at Vinoculture Wine Tribe.
Yeah, so it gets much more like a Chular sandy loam once you're on the bench, and then there's DG and throughout a decent amount of the Santa Lucia Highlands, our vineyard has definitely like some deposits throughout. It's all relatively harmonious in terms of, or homogeneous in terms of having the same, geological structure. There, where the Chardonnay is planted, it's more alluvial. Everything kind of goes down to the Salinas River, which runs parallel with the Santa Lucia Highlands. They're north to south, a long, thin appellation, and then the river runs aside them, just on the east side. So out of the mountains, there's a watershed that goes down to the river, which is partially why I started taking the vineyard mostly dry since 16, just really realizing that I could get the roots to go down to the shed and they would be far more self-sufficient than putting water on top. The soil, there's not really clay. It's pretty sandy, but there's definitely it has a decent amount of water retention. We only get about 14, 13 inches of rain a year on average. So it's pretty light. Yeah. And it holds it decently, but it doesn't overly, it doesn't overly hold water, the overall soil. And it goes from about 250 feet to 500 feet. So there's a decent incline. So it's not like there's, water sitting anywhere. It generally runs off when it rains and absorbs what it absorbs. So right now we're thinking about filling the profile up and kind of getting through the year and going on to being able to dry farm throughout next year. So hopefully we get some rain in the next, couple months. We'll see. It's been pretty dry so far.
Hopefully. Well, I am just struck by the harmonious nature of these wines, like we were talking about, but there is this sense of verve and tension at the same time. And to balance that is really difficult. I find either my wines are very harmonious, which is lovely, but sometimes not as interesting or compelling. And sometimes there's so much intrigue and what's going on that it's just hard to relax with the wine. And I think you have struck this really, really beautiful balance of the two, that tension, that conversation, along with the integration. So thank you. They're beautiful, beautiful wines.
I appreciate that very much.
Well, I look forward to recommending these wines to everyone here in Virginia for the holiday season. And I'll tell them all to tag you in the post so that you can see what they're drinking it with. Last question, and then I promise I'll let you go. Can you just talk to me about your favorite food pairing with sparkling wine? Because it's not just for toasting. It should be your first go-to for some food pairings.
Fried chicken.
Yeah. We did I won't name the producer, but I worked with a chef. We did a winemaker from France, from a famous Champagne area, came and we were doing a luncheon for a bunch of industry people. And so we were chosen in the restaurant to do an actual sit down 3-course luncheon for it. And so everyone else is like, oh, what are you going to do? And naming all these super fancy things. And the chef and I were like, let's do fried chicken and then potato chips dipped in creme fraiche with caviar.
Yep. That's it.
Salty, fatty, crunchy. Yes.
You're speaking my language.
Thank you for saying that. I love it.
Yep.
Well, when you come over here, the chef is kind of known for having the best fried chicken in the entire world. So next time you're in Virginia, I will treat you to fried chicken if you bring a bottle of this wine.
Done. We got a date.
Awesome.
I love it.
Well, thank you so much, Scott, for your afternoon and spending some time with us and educating us on your wines. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you in real life in the future. We'll make a California trip out there when we can travel again.
Absolutely, look forward to it. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.